Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Digital Defense, a weekly cybersecurity show broadcasting from the Bloomberg News Washington, D.C. Bureau. As we do every week, this is an interactive show. My name is Jordan Robertson. I'm a cybersecurity reporter here in Washington for Bloomberg. We're streaming live on Facebook and Periscope. And also, if you want to ask some questions, we encourage that. Feel free to ask about the topic of today's show or any other cybersecurity question on your mind. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. You can feel free to write those questions in the comment section of wherever you're watching this feed, or you can tweet at us to the Bloomberg Technology page, which is @technology on Twitter. We'll see those questions in real time there, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So this week, I wanted to revisit a subject that we touched on a few weeks ago, which proved to be pretty popular with viewers, and there's a lot of grist for future shows in this subject. And the subject is, what do you have to give law enforcement in terms of passwords and other private data? When you're stopped, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a federal investigator, whether it's a customs agent, any law enforcement authority. What are your rights, especially as it comes to your smartphone? And the jumping off point for this is a new phone from Samsung, which is launching, which is really cool. It's getting some good reviews, and it's the Galaxy S8 from Samsung, and it's packed with a lot of interesting features. The one that kind of caught my attention was that it has a facial recognition unlock feature. And the interesting part about this is, writing about hackers and covering hackers, it didn't take long for a group of hackers to figure out that you could defeat this facial recognition unlocking feature with a photo of somebody. So it doesn't even have to be a real person, it can just be a photo of somebody, and they can unlock your phone if you've set this as your password. And the obvious implications there are such that you wouldn't have to be the person at all. You just have to have a photo of them, or a good photo of them, and you can get into their phone. This is not an entirely novel strategy, but it does have some implications for this broader question of what are your rights when a law enforcement agent asks you to unlock your phone? Turns out it's a pretty compelling question with some pretty surprising answers. So I wanted to walk you through some of those tips, if you will, and advice about what you do and don't have to do if you are stopped by a law enforcement official. So just to backtrack a little bit, if you have a modern smartphone these days, chances are you're going to have the option to do one of these forms of biometric authentication. Now, there are varying degrees of security for these things. As I just described, the facial recognition thing is cool, but it's not very secure. Google has had this problem before. It has had facial recognition unlock feature on Android phones for some time. They've tried to add additional technologies to it to detect a live face versus a static face or a photo of a person. And the technology is getting better, but it's still not foolproof for the obvious reason that computers can have a tough time distinguishing a live face from a photo. But there are lots of other types as well. You'll have iris scans, which are really good. Those are very secure. You'll have fingerprint scans, which also are very unique to an individual and very secure. So you might have 3 or 4 different ways to log into your phone that are not your password. But the question that really interests me is not how hackable are they, because as I just mentioned, facial recognition, somewhat hackable, iris, fingerprints, not so hackable. And turns out, kind of when it comes to law enforcement, the most unhackable of all when it comes to the law is the plain old password. So, the theme of this show and kind of what I want your main takeaway to be is that, when it comes to securing your device, there's a difference between securing your device from hackers and securing it from law enforcement, whether you're stopped at a traffic stop or, as I say, at the border. And it turns out, there are pretty strong protections, the courts have ruled, under the Fifth Amendment for you to deny law enforcement officers the password to your device. Under the terms of the law, what that's considered is information you know. And under the Fifth Amendment, you're protected by the Constitution, from being forced to incriminate yourself or to testify against yourself. And a quirk of the law, which I find pretty interesting, is that something like your password, it's considered something you know. So if a police officer asks you to unlock your phone and it's secured by a password or a PIN code, either of those two, those are considered things that you know. You are not obligated in really almost any circumstance to give that up. And courts have ruled, and these types of cases have been fought very strenuously by law enforcement agencies saying, we have a computer or we have a phone, we need to get access to it, but the person has encrypted it with a passcode or a passphrase. And courts have pretty consistently ruled that law enforcement has less ground to stand on in forcing you to give up that information. Now, of course, there are other things they can do to you in that time to make it hard for you to continue resisting. Nevertheless, the idea that protecting your password is a constitutionally protected right is a really important thing to remember if you are in a position to be targeted, or potentially detained, whether you're in the protest movement, whether you're a journalist or human rights activist, or political official, things like that. Really important to remember. There is a difference, though, when it comes to these things like biometrics. And I want to break in here as well, just to let you know, again, interactive show. We encourage any and all questions, as we're talking about this. So if you have any questions about how this stuff works, do let us know. Again, you can write questions in the comment section, or you can tweet at us at Technology, which is the Bloomberg Technology page. We'll see the questions there. When it comes to biometrics, facial recognition, iris scans, or fingerprint scans, these are all very interesting, very novel, evolving technologies. But interestingly enough, when it comes to law enforcement, these are not considered things that showing your face, for obvious reasons, does not count as testifying against yourself. Providing a fingerprint does not constitute testifying against yourself. Same goes for, an iris scan. And, the really tricky legal question this raises is, sure, we understand that in the context of showing up at the police station, you're going to have to be photographed, you're going to have to give fingerprints. All of those things have to happen to authenticate who you are. But what happens if you've used that biometric, that image or that fingerprint to secure a device? And, that device should have these constitutional protections. What happens then? It's a tricky legal issue that, really hasn't been resolved. But I think it does raise some important points about how you secure devices, and most importantly, when you get a new phone like this, like Samsung, they're going to present you with marketing materials that look like this. This is an actual ad for the Samsung phone. Security that's foolproof. It shows, a person using their iris scan as a login mechanism. It shows that it provides her a couple different options, the iris scan, drawing a pattern. Like, you have a million different ways to log into these devices, but they're going to bill this stuff as security that's foolproof. You can see right here, and it's important to recognize, if you're in a position to worry about this kind of stuff, which journalists do, human rights activists do, a lot of people do, who are you securing it from? As I mentioned earlier, this is helpful against hackers, but not helpful against law enforcement. We're getting some good questions here. Thanks for all of you who are writing in. We encourage anybody to do so. First question here is, will there come a time when passwords completely go away and everything uses fingerprints or iris scans? Here's the thing. On their own, these are terrific ways to doubly authenticate yourself. Every company with sensitive information, or any company of any size, will use some form of these. So they'll use a password plus something else, a password plus a facial recognition, password plus iris scan, or whatever, or fingerprint. That's actually really good security. If you're thinking about securing a network, or providing extra security to a device or an account, these are great things to do. And the technology is getting really good to the point where you can do voice as well. Computers can recognize an individual's voice, very accurately. So as an additional security layer, these things are becoming more common, and that's generally a good thing. However, the problem does become, passwords are so easy to compromise, whether you lose it or it's taken in a hack. If the only thing securing your account is a password, you potentially could be in trouble, because that's the way people get hacked. And anybody who's watched this show before, will know that I'm a pretty strenuous advocate of using two-factor authentication for all of your sensitive accounts, which means a password plus something else. The problem becomes when you make it the only thing that secures your device. And that's where things get tricky, because you could be forced to reveal that information, and you could have no recourse if that's the only thing that's securing your device or your account. Next question is, how exactly can people hack facial recognition? Well, it's a funny question, because it turns out it's actually not all that hard. So, there are different types of computer recognition. as I mentioned earlier, voice recognition has actually come a really long way, and in fact is ahead of a lot of these other areas. So computers can recognize voices really, really well now. That's how you can have things like Siri, and you can have things like Google's voice search, and it's actually really good. When it comes to facial recognition, though, I'll go back to a screen here to give you a sense of what it looks like. A facial recognition is not the comprehensive view of a person that we get as humans when we see each other. When you see another person, you're processing millions of data points about that person and the structure of their face and features and things like that. A computer has to pick data points, and it can't pick as many as a human could, so it will literally pick a few. It will pick maybe half a dozen, maybe a dozen if you're lucky. And I've had this described to me by security experts, like, okay, well, what exactly is it looking for? What's like the most accurate thing to look for in a face for a computer to figure out who's who when it comes to facial recognition? And one of the things it turns out, one of the most important things in facial recognition, turns out, is the space between your eyes and the space between the features kind of in the top third of your top half of your face. And the reason being, it's not just the shape of the eyes, which I assumed it might be, but it's the distance between them. And that's just because it's something that computers can very easily measure, and because it varies from person to person kind of to a wide degree. So what hackers do is they can hack those algorithms. They can figure out, what are the data points that are going into these models, and how do you create simulations of a person's face that is accurate enough. It'll never be perfect. Again, it's not like a human looking at another human, but even we get stuff wrong there. It's how many data points go into that algorithm, and how can you approximate somebody's face to the point that a computer recognizes it. And I should say, in the case of Samsung's phone, these were pictures of individuals. So like I would set the phone to recognize my face when I log in as a live human being. Then I would take a photo of me taken at some point in the past, and the computer would also recognize that. The reason that's happening, again, it's taking only a limited number of data points, such as the space between eyes, general structure of the face, and kind of general length, those kinds of measurements, and that's it. And it's not taking a comprehensive view, of a person. Next question here, we're getting a lot of good ones. Iris scans are appearing in lots of other places too, like airports. Do the same security risks exist there? Well, difference is if you're in a public place, you do give up a lot of your rights to privacy. So if a government agency or a business has determined these are the security mechanisms that you have to adhere to enter that place, you generally have fewer options. In the case of airports, there are options for non-technological screenings. That's a case where if people have health or privacy risks about certain technologies, they can opt out for something else. That generally means added time and added weight. But in many places, you do have options. It's a matter of, what specifically are you concerned about? If it's a government, taking that information and amassing a database, if you're concerned that government could potentially turn hostile to you, that's a pretty valid concern, especially considering things like irises, things like fingerprints are very, very uniquely identifiable to you. So those databases can be matched and correlated in a pretty strong way. Next question here is, what about two-factor authentication and biometrics and a password? Is that safe? Well, as I mentioned earlier, two-factor authentication is a huge improvement in the way online accounts are secured, and I'm a big advocate of using it for every account that you have. Usually that takes the form of a text message or an email or maybe a callback to an individual, but increasingly, this person is right, biometrics and a password are increasingly becoming an option, and I'm a big fan. Smart companies do this all the time. Certainly the government does this. If you've got a password, that's the baseline, but it's easy to crack. If you also have a fingerprint or another biometrics reading, that's going to provide you an additional layer of security that you really can't get even through the world's most complicated password. So I think that's generally a really good thing. Again, my advice with these kinds of things are, if you want to experiment with technology, that's great and it's fun, it's fine. And if you're not really in a position where you feel you're at risk for these kinds of hacks, a facial recognition could be your sole login for a phone. It's not everybody that would be concerned about these things. If, however, as I say, if you're concerned about being detained by law enforcement in any capacity, having that alone as your login is probably going to be a mistake, because they can easily get access to your phone. I want to show you another one here as well. I'm a big fan of kind of knowing your rights. and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, distributes these kinds of ads where they say, I don't consent to the search of this device. And it's a good thing to remember. You don't have to give really any law enforcement access to your device. However, they could go to court to get a warrant. There are lots of things that they could do if they're interested enough in you to try to get access. But it's a good thing to remember. You don't automatically have to give access to things that you don't feel comfortable giving access to. Next question here, are third-party locking apps more secure than an iPhone password? Well, I suppose it's important to distinguish between, who's doing the locking and what is being locked. So, in this case, it's not so much that Samsung itself is insecure. It's that its facial recognition technology can be defeated. So, if you're using that as the sole mechanism for locking this device, that's going to be a problem. Whether that's done by Samsung, whether it's done by a third-party app, other companies may have different technologies that are better. Certainly there's an ecosystem there that exists. But in general, the big idea is don't rely solely on biometrics to log into your account. That's kind of the big takeaway, regardless of whether it's Apple. Apple's had its Touch ID for a long time, and that's been hacked for a long time too. People have shown how you can defeat that. We've all seen spy movies where they'll take a person's fingerprint off a glass or off a piece of paper and replicate that, and and kind of use that to defeat a touch login for a phone like the iPhone. However, companies put a lot of effort into trying to determine, is this a live person touching the phone or looking into the phone? So it's a cat and mouse game there. But again, it's not necessarily who makes the technology, it's how many steps do you have to get into your account is the key. Next question here, are you better off just turning off your phone when confronted by a police officer asking you to unlock it? No, because if you just turn it on and there's no passcode, they can just do that all day long. I think what the person is trying to ask is, there's a related question. If you encrypt devices and you turn them off, sometimes you have to turn them off to encrypt like a full disk drive. If you go to those lengths to encrypt your entire hard drive on your computer, sometimes you have to turn the computer off to do that. So if that's what this person is asking, then yes, it actually is a good idea to, if you're fully encrypting your device, sometimes you have to turn it off to make that happen. It's absolutely a good idea then, if you're confronted by law enforcement or going through an airport, to fully power down the device so that when it's powered back on, it's been fully encrypted and you need the passcode to log in. It's a good question because some forms of encryption do require that. In general, though, with a phone, it's once the phone is off, once the lock screen comes on, and you've secured it with a passphrase or a passcode, that's generally enough. Law enforcement will have to ask you for that. And again, I'm a big believer in knowing what you have to say yes to and what you can say no to. Even if you have nothing to hide, it's just important to know your rights. And this is an area that's evolving in the law. And you might assume that you could do something like refuse to give a fingerprint or refuse to give a facial scan. That's not the case. And it's important to know that as well, so you don't get yourself into trouble. Next question here is, how is scanning your iris not considered a search under the Fourth Amendment? Very good question. Fourth Amendment, when we talk about constitutional protections against unreasonable or unlawful search and seizure, we generally talk about, there's a distinction for law enforcement between things that they can see and things that they think they know. I'm no legal scholar, but my general kind of layman's understanding of this is, the example I'd like to use sometimes, if an officer is walking by a house and they see a marijuana plant growing in the window and it's illegal to grow marijuana in that place, that is probable cause to search to search that location and to get a a warrant to go search that place. So, in the context of biometrics, something that an officer can see, like drugs growing in a window, if they can see your face and they can see your irises, the courts have determined that is not an unlawful search to force you to provide an iris scan if you're being detained lawfully by law enforcement. It's a tricky question, though. I mean, it's important to note that these issues are far from resolved because what you're having more and more are cases like Apple versus the FBI in California, where the FBI wanted Apple's help in unlocking a locked iPhone, and it was a huge deal and will remain a huge deal. Bloomberg has reported that the FBI wants another crack at that issue in regard to Apple. So this issue of unlocking phones and what are your rights, either as a company or an individual, when it comes to unlocking something, are far from settled. So while many courts have said that things that you can see, like a face or a fingerprint or even an iris scan, those do not constitute unlawful search and seizure. It's far from settled, and you can expect a lot of legal debate about this as police agencies and federal agencies bring cases about this into the future. Let's see here. Last question here. We're getting some really good ones. Thanks so much to everybody for writing in. Law enforcement is only one group. What about Facebook, Google, and other tech giants? How are we protected from them? Well, another question I like, because there are issues of law enforcement. The state has a monopoly on power, right? And the government has a monopoly on power. So they can lock you up, they can execute you, they can do all kinds of things when it comes to enforcing the law that, of course, private companies can't do. However, private companies, when compelled by governments, are effectively an arm of law enforcement. So what this person is asking is, say I've given all this data to a company like Facebook, or I've given it to Google. Apple has taken a pretty strong stance on things like your fingerprint and other biometric scans. I believe are not stored by the company. They are stored locally on the device and then erased. That's a really important distinction, because when Apple came out with its Touch ID feature, a lot of people said, oh my God, Apple's creating like the world's master database of fingerprints. And Apple went out of their way to say, no, it's not what we're doing. And every sign that I've seen points to that being true. And there are good business reasons for doing that as well. Apple does not want to necessarily be the repository of the world's fingerprints, because then they will be the target of law enforcement actions, kind of more than they could possibly handle. But it is an important question that when companies roll out technology like the Samsung feature, how is that data being stored? Who's storing it? Is it just on my device? Is there a way to prove that? If so, people like me are going to be a lot less concerned about it and write fewer stories about it. If, however, there is a centralized repository of this stuff, that becomes a very tricky question, because then you are essentially creating a dossier about yourself that law enforcement could ask for at any time. And companies like Google and others, could use it. A good example is, these companies, Google and Facebook and others, have become expert at facial recognition. So, whenever you tag somebody on Facebook, the machine learning that goes into figuring out who else is in your photo is really phenomenal and really spooky as well. So the ability to link people between accounts, just looking at photos, it's a pretty concerning thing going forward, especially if you have kids and you think about their photos online from when they're really young, following them into their adulthood, without their kind of consent. People posting photos of their kids online, and then as they get older, facial recognition being able to track them throughout the years. These are really thorny privacy issues that regulators are going to have to take a look at. And you should probably expect that companies will do what's best for their business, and what's best for their business is improving these algorithms and collecting as much data as possible. So with that, I want to thank everybody for writing in with questions. This is it's a fun show for us, and this is going to be a topic we're going to revisit pretty frequently, because it's one that's close to my heart, and I think it's useful as well, because we all have fears about law enforcement and things like that. So it's helpful to know your rights. So expect to see more on the same topic in the future. In closing, I want to wrap up by saying you can feel free to tweet me offline. My Twitter is @JordanR1000, JORDAN, letter R 1000. Please feel free to write with any questions or suggestions for future shows. We're wide open to receiving those. @Technology as well as another place to put that. And please do check out our podcast as well. It's called Decrypted. You can go to bloomberg.com/technology and check out the link there. We do some pretty cool stuff there as well, and appreciate your support in all those ventures. So with that, signing off, and we'll see you next week, Thursdays, noon Eastern, and we'll see you next time on Digital Defense.